we are starting out the day with an African storyteller, and I'm very pleased to introduce a former colleague of mine who I think is an amazing person, Mwihaki Muraguri. She is someone who loves words, who loves the kind of the written word, the spoken word, a book, a poem. The words have always been central to her in her life. She has had a very varied career in philanthropy, in development, across sub-Saharan Africa. She has done a lot of work in public health, in broader issues of development and philanthropy. But today she really focuses on, she has built her own enterprise, Pahuka, a storytelling house or a story house that's dedicated to showcasing and sharing positive stories from the continent from an authentically African perspective. Mwihaki is based in Nairobi and she joins us from there. And I think over to you, Mwihaki.
Thank you so much, Claudia, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening across the globe. So I'm going to do what hopefully will not be the first tech fail of the day. I'm going to try and share my screen. So let's see how that will work. Success? Success, yes. So thank you for that kind introduction, Claudia, and I will start off with a confession. I was looking through the Cloudera website, trying to get a handle on who my audience was going to be today. And I saw that you have offices from across the globe. Some places were familiar, like Amsterdam and London, and others were places that I have only dreamed of visiting. So there was Budapest and Tokyo and Sydney and Sao Paulo and Cork, yes, and Cork, because one day I must make it to Ireland. And I admit that I thought to myself, okay, so African woman, background in public health, focus on working throughout the continent, not a techie, although I am married to one, so I hope that counts for something here. And then there was the topic of today, which is around women's empowerment. And I admit that I was somewhat stumped. And partly because, let's face it, when people talk about empowered women, the African woman is not the first image that pops into a lot of people's minds. And so as I was struggling to think, okay, so what can I share today? I went back to my little arsenal, the thing that I know best, and that's just tell a story. And tell a story of my own perspective on women and empowerment and the spaces in between, and hope that in doing so, from, like I say, my perspective, there will be some places of overlap as a professional, because we're both professional. We all, you and I, are both professionals. And hopefully in sharing this story, you might find that maybe we're not so different. So let me start with my first story. Oh, that was what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to start with me. But let me start with my first story. And my first story is the first benchmark in my life, which was my mother. She was born in the 1940s. She's now in her 70s, when Kenya was still a colonial state. And she was brought up by her grandmother, who was the first girl in her location to be educated. So this was literally 100 years ago, so the late teens, early 1920s. And my great-grandmother went on to be a nurse. But my mother was the first in her family to attend and graduate from university. That was the University of East Africa in the early 1970s. And back then, if you were a university graduate, you got a job, no question. And so she joined the Kenya government in the civil service, and she worked there for 36 years. But there was something a little bit different about her in the service, because she was an officer. Most women at that time were secretaries. And so she was an oddity, quite frankly. And one of the things that she started doing very early in her career is, because all all officers used to sign off with just their initials and then their last name, she would put Mrs. in brackets. And that was her stand, showing that I am loud and proud. I am a woman, I'm a married woman, and I am here. And I often wonder what, caused that for her to happen, right? What made her make that decision that every letter that she signed off had to be C.N. Kimura, Mrs. But growing up in my mother's house was interesting because we were part of her work. When she worked with the Ministry of Tourism, during our holidays, we'd be carted off to various game parks and national reserves in Kenya as she was checking out various lodges and hotels. When she worked for the Ministry of Finance, we knew when it was budget season because we would never see her before bedtime, right? So for 2 months of the year, she was dedicated to the National Treasury. And so for my brothers and I, the fact that women work, the fact that women are decision makers in their jobs, and the fact that, if mom was working somewhere, you could be called to tag along was our norm. And as we all know, until the world tells us otherwise, we assume that our norm is everybody else's norm. Which brings me to my second story. And we fast forwarded a few years, and I am now a graduate from university and trying to look for a job. And like most Kenyans, back then we used to do what we would call tarmacking, which was literally dropping off your CV in various places in an effort to try and apply for a job. And so eventually I did get one. And it was with Amref Health Africa. And Amref Health Africa is Africa's largest health and development NGO. And my role was bringing to life a volunteer program where students in universities and tertiary educations got to go and work in Amref and then got to have work experience, which was much needed on their CVs. And when I joined Amref, back then there was no office, what do they call, open plan offices. So we all had, sort of closed offices in four walls. And my desk was in the office of a lady by the name of Nikki Blundell Brown. Now, Nikki was, as different as me as could be. I was literally about probably half her age. She had at least 25, 30 years on me. She was British, I was Kenyan. She was white, I was black. She was a hurricane. I was an unsure young graduate trying to fake it till I make it. But honestly, a gift of my life was, having a desk in Nikki's little office, because even though she wasn't my supervisor and she wasn't my boss, she was the kind of person who would take responsibility for anybody who was in her orbit. So even though I was trying hard to mask my lack of knowledge and, trying to navigate this world of work, I didn't know what I didn't know. It was my first job. And so everybody who walked through Nikki's door, she'd say, and that's Mwihaki, my colleague, and she'd say, Mwihaki, turn around, enter this conversation. Mwihaki, you need to know so-and-so because they do this and that in Amref. And I literally became her handbag. So she'd carry me along everywhere, to meetings, to conversations, to negotiations. And this is where, as a professional, I was forged in the fire. Now, as many of you know, your first year on the job is a learning curve. And it's not necessarily a learning curve because you don't know the content, although as an entry-level worker, you probably don't. But it's a learning curve because you have to learn an institution, the culture, the shortcuts, the workarounds, the hierarchies. And I didn't realize, but in becoming Nikki's handbag, that's what she did for me. She allowed me to understand how work actually happens. And in so doing, I was able to get a sense of what I needed to grow into as a young woman entering the workplace. I got to understand that you close a loop on every conversation. And back then it wasn't even email, it was typing up a memo to say as agreed. And as she did all that for me, I didn't really get a sense of what was happening because, again, I assumed this was the norm. It wasn't until much, much later that I realized just how lucky I had been to get assigned a space in that particular office, because that's how I learned the world of work. And I got a role model to help me understand spaces that I would one day, like I say, be operating in. I had a senior who was treating me as a peer, one who allowed me to ask dumb questions because of the nature of our relationship, and one who allowed me to understand that my presence in that place was enough. I didn't need to be any more than who I actually was. I did not need to re-engineer myself to fit into some mold. All I had to do was to grow into myself as a young professional woman. And that's a photo of Nikki and me. We had lunch, I think, about just before Corona changed everything. And the last story is my aha moment, because these things do not come to us and we understand them as they happened. I, as Claudia said, I've had the opportunity to work in many organizations, fine institutions, which had strong HR systems and talent programs and succession plans and performance reviews. And I think that, because of those structures, I was enabled to do the things that I was supposed to do as a supervisor, as a boss, as someone who was responsible for teams. I would like to think that I was an empowering person, but I can only hear from the people who I worked with. But 4 years ago, I started my own firm, Paukwa. And I can assure you that my biggest fear was my first hire. I was very afraid. And my first hire was Natalie. Natalie was literally half my age. We share a birthday. She was 21 when she joined. And we were sitting across a desk in a co-working space because it was a startup. And about a year after she joined, she was talking about me at a function. And she started using terms and words that I admit made me feel very uncomfortable, because she was saying that, Mwihaki is my role model and she's my mentor and I really appreciate her. And I was like, okay, wait, hold up. This was not what I expected of our relationship. But then it hit me that what people take with them is not the title that you hold, but the experience of the relationship between you. And unwittingly, whether I had intended it or not, I was setting a bar. I was putting in place an ideal for a young woman who was entering the workplace. And so it strikes me that as we talk about women's empowerment, which is a huge topic, which requires, it means different things in different spaces. The professional in me is talking today to the professional in you, but the human in me is also talking to the human in you. That as parents, as aunties, as uncles, as mentors and neighbors, we unknowingly set the bar each and every day of our lives, just like my mother did, just like Nikki did, for all the people who are in our orbit. Whether it's about what work-life balance or work-life integration should look like, whether it is what professional sacrifices are expected of one on a daily basis and what is in and what is out in terms of us thinking about who you are as a professional, whether it's the space that is allowed and provided by spouses and partners who are ready to support women who are working. These are the spaces that I call the ones which are in between. This is how we live the idea of women's empowerment. And it doesn't really matter whether it's, whether you're male, female, living in Sydney or Sao Paulo. This goes to the heart of who we are. And yes, you and I, as mothers, daughters, brothers, husbands, we aren't that different after all in terms of the opportunities we have to set norms for what empowerment means for the people around us. And so when I stopped to think about what my mother, what Nikki did for me, And when I started to understand just how unique of a gift I had been given, I realized that what they did was they disconnected me from the idea of a glass ceiling. I didn't know that it existed. And because of that, I was able to power through it, not even knowing that I was powering through. They taught me to be the very best version of myself, and that is what the world needs from me. And as I think about what women's empowerment means, I think it means normalization. I think it means setting the norm of what we want it to be. And so much as these are your days of service, and I know that there's a lot of focus about what you can do in this period today or this week, I want to challenge you all to live a new way and make women's empowerment your year of service and not just your day. By being a version of you that extends, that invites, that sees, that bears witness to people in your team, people in your workspace, the women and girls who are around you. Let's normalize extending ourselves to the person that we brush past every day. Let's normalize empowering their journey by opening doors that, because they are absolutely the opposite of us, they wouldn't even know that it was a closed door in front of them. Let's not assume that they are able to navigate their way around. And may this be a moment that hopefully we can remember that the impact of our lived lives have an impact on people around us, and that the choices that we make implicitly or explicitly affect the way that other people see themselves and their place in this world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mwihaki. What a wonderful way, at least for me, it's 9 a.m. here in California, and this was a wonderful way to start the day. And so I appreciate that. So there's a couple of things. I'm Lily Giraldo, the program manager for Cloudera Cares, and we do have some time for questions from the audience. And so if you have anything you'd like to ask, please drop it in the chat and I will take a look. We have about 8 minutes left. In the meantime, though, again, I wanted to thank you. I also wanted to say that, one of the pluses of my job and one of the pluses of planning these events and doing the speaker series is that I get to connect with such interesting and inspiring people. And you, Mwihaki, definitely fall in that category. It was wonderful to connect in preparation for the Global Days of Service. And I knew we'd be in good hands and you'd have a great story to tell. And I also really enjoyed that you provided an uplifting perspective. I think right now in this moment of time, we could all hear these stories of success and women supporting women. And also too, kind of to Claudia's point at the beginning, it's great to hear you kind of challenge the narrative that we hear so often about countries within Africa, and sharing a story of joy and success. And that doesn't just apply to Africa. I think it's to many developing countries. We only see the negative parts instead of hear that is great. And then also that your talk, we can all relate to a lot of the things that you said, and it brings us all together. We're in so many different places. So let's see. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll wait
not a question, and thank you, Mwihaki, that this was really, it definitely set the tone for the day and maybe the tone for the year, and an important reminder. And maybe people and women in Cloudera have comments as well, and not only questions. But I think one thing that I found was an important reminder that it is not about, kind of a manager mentoring a person that is reporting to him or her. But it is about this, kind of the role that Nikki played for you, because you were sitting together in an office, and so thinking about Cloudera in the sense of, across divisions, across teams, or within your team as a peer, what can we do for women to lift each other up? I think that was an important takeaway I had, and yeah, others might have other takeaways.
We do. So we have a comment here from Linda. Everything you said was so positive. How do you keep away the negatives? It's a great question.
Interesting question. don't want to, make out that everything is rosy. But I think a lot of these things are choices. I live, as has been mentioned, in Kenya, and we have a lot which is fractured, which is broken. And our media is very good at putting a magnifying glass on that. And so I've made a choice, and our work as Paukwa is to focus on the positives, to try and provide that balance so that we're not looking at the positives, with this sort of long telescope that they're out there, but bringing them front and forward and giving them the power of the magnifying glass as well. And in doing that, I think that we are seeing positive results. I'll give you one example. We all know that social media can be quite a toxic mess, to say the least. And we put out our stories on social media every single day. And in the course of 4 years, literally, in terms of the feedback and the engagement and comments that we get on social media, less than 5% of it is negative, is toxic. It's usually, wow, I didn't know that. How come I don't know this? Where can I read more? And what I've learned over the last couple of years is that, and this is, I think we were all taught when we were very young, what you put out, you will receive tenfold. And so that's the frame of mind that I choose to engage with when it comes to the world.
Thank you. So another question, I think we'll make this our last question. So how do we foster these connections when increasingly so many of us are working remotely, and the casual chats over a coffee in the office are not as easy because we're balancing work with the in-between, and we're all dealing with this?
Yeah, that's been a tough year. I miss the random chats in the office. And what I used as a coping mechanism, because when the containment took place in Kenya and we had to start working from home, is that I actually calendared social calls on my calendar, because Outlook rules my life. And so on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I had a reminder at 4:00 just to call a friend. And it was calling somebody who lived alone, because I realized that it was much harder for them than me. And I think that that's the way that I do it, because I know that if something is not on my calendar, it's unlikely to happen. And I'd encourage others, if they struggle with that as well, remember to call, the person you used to talk to at the water cooler, or who used to have lunch with. Have your working lunch again over Zoom instead of the cafeteria.
Great advice. I need to start doing that as well. And I think like all of us, I definitely miss those conversations in the office. I don't think I realized how important they were, just those small conversations, until I didn't have them, or we don't have them. So thank you so much, Mwihaki. I appreciate this. It's such a unique perspective that you provided.